if you follow the geopolitical change closely, and there's no doubt that we're in the year of 2024, I guess the word that comes to our mind is uncertainty. Especially we're looking at this political change or this political turmoil in the nation of United States of America. And given the fact today that this nation is rather standing at the crossroads, and it's not just about this political change, and also from this economic agenda as well. But meanwhile, when we talk about America, it's rather crucial and also significant. We need to look back the history of the country. Again, on this episode, we've been discussing the contributions from the founding fathers. Again, if you follow our show closely, we talk about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and so forth. Now, without a doubt, those founding fathers, and despite the fact that they had different ideas about the direction for the country, but at the same time, they meant well, and they believe America has always been the champion for democracy, and despite the differences and despite this political division in the country. But fast forward, again, when we understand or try to decipher the complication of the history, it's rather important for us to understand what happened in the past and also this complicated relationship between America with some of the countries. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Professor Nathan Perl-Rosenthal. Again, Professor Nathan Perl is a professor of history at the University of Southern California, and his writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, The Nation, of course, and he came out with his brand new amazing book, which is called The Age of Revolutions and the Generations Who Made It. Well, Professor, thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thanks so much, Will. It's great to be here.
Well, Professor, I want to get started. Again, I have to say, as I mentioned in the intro, the more I read about this book, and the more question I have, especially let's go back to the title of the book. It's called Revolutions. I mean, again, as we mentioned before, when we talk about the word revolutions, historically speaking, we're looking at, all those battles and all those wars that Americans fought over the decades before 1776. But we know in this book, when you use the word revolutions, it's beyond all those famous wars and conflict that we study in schools or even, read in the textbooks. Can you help us with better understanding what is the significance of using the word revolutions, and how does that even signify the progress that you covered in this book for the country? Go ahead.
It's a great question, and one that I talk about a lot with specialists and with general readers. And I actually think this is one of those things where non-specialists actually know more than the specialists sometimes. Because I think historians have a tendency to get and sociologists have a tendency to get very focused on what are really the kind of 19th century definitions of revolution. The idea that revolution is a social revolution, that is a transformation of both the political sphere, but also of the social order. And so there's been a vast amount of scholarship which has argued that there are only a few real revolutions in history. My favorite example of this is a very famous French revolutionary historian, Albert Mathiez, who started his book. The first sentence of his book is revolutions, the real ones, and he means by that the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. That's it. Everything else is out. And I think actually that's a mistake when you're looking at the late 18th and early 19th century. That definition actually hurts more than it helps for the following reason. Because people in the late 18th and early 19th century, that is to say the era of the American Revolution, of the French Revolution, of Spanish American independence, they actually use the word revolution in a very broad way. They think any kind of rapid political change, and even things that aren't political, they talk about moral revolutions. They talk about revolutions in manners. Any kind of really rapid transformation for them is a revolution. And so I think it's important actually to try to understand what people in that period were thinking, what people like, you just mentioned George Washington, Jefferson. What did they mean when they said revolution? Well, I think what they meant was it could mean a lot of things. It could mean a transformation of the social order, or for someone like George Washington, who was quite happy with the way the social order was. Let's not forget George Washington is a big slave owner. It meant political change, but I get to keep all my stuff, and I get to keep being, the local nobleman, basically, the local gentry. So again, I think a broad definition of revolution, especially if we're thinking about that period, 250 years ago, is really crucial and helps us understand better what's going on.
Professor, again, I want to go back to this book. Of course, at the introduction session, that you mentioned the word sovereignty, and I want to read something to you, and I think it's interesting that, again, compare with what we're trying to define the word sovereignty today when we look at this political and social system in America. To be confident, it's rather different than the previous, or from the historical sense. And again, this is what you wrote: that the government, based on the sovereignty of the people, gave the populace a new voice in politics, yet most excluded women and the non-white people from full citizenship. Now, there's a lot of information to unpack, but let's talk about the sovereignty of the people. I mean, again, historically speaking, Professor, you're the expert and you're the historian. Help us with better understanding. How should we define the term sovereignty of the people? I understand when I was in high school, even undergraduate school, even graduate school, we talk about American history and we talk about this independence and the sovereignty for the colonies. But I believe right here, it's beyond just being independent and just beyond have the full acknowledgement to the citizens. Why is that word is so significant from the historical perspective?
Yeah. Well, I think there are two sort of things that you need to say about the sovereignty of the people, and I think it's great that you homed in on that, because that is one of the crucial phrases of the late 18th, early 19th century. It's one of the kind of those little nuggets that exists before, but really comes into its own in that period, and it just continues to be absolutely central to the way that we think about politics to this day. So there are two things to be said. One is sovereignty of the people is, what are the people? Well, that's an interesting question. The people are an abstraction. A person is a person. A group of people are people, but sovereignty of the people in that phrase are an abstraction. They're not, you can't necessarily point to individual people and say, well, these people are sovereign, right? There's a notion of some kind of abstraction, which in fact transcends time and place, right? So the people who are included in the sovereignty of the people include not only those currently living, but presumably also those not yet born, right? I mean, when we say that the people are sovereign, we don't mean it's the people who are alive right now. We mean this abstraction that exists in some sense across time and space. And when we say the sovereignty of the people, we don't just mean the ones who are in a particular place. We also mean the ones who belong to that nation elsewhere. So it's an abstraction, and the people is an abstraction there. And that's one of the confusing things, because we think of people as it's a very concrete word, right? There's a group of people over there. But here, in this phrase, people is an idea, not a thing, not a living, breathing thing. And so, like any abstraction, it can be more or less broad, right? You can think about it as including a lot of people, or the people, as you define it in that case, can be very, very narrow, right? So this is how you can make a kind of a notion of sovereignty of the people, which is at the same time quite exclusive, because you simply say, well, when I said the people, what I meant was the people who are financially independent, which is actually what people thought in the late 18th century. When we say people, what we mean is the people who are able to be sovereign, which is people who basically own enough property that they can live on their own resources, right? So then you basically mean independent, grown men, plus maybe some women who have inherited property in some way, right? Either they're widows or, daughters of wealthy men. And everyone else is not part of the people in that sense, right? The other reason that this phrase is important, so it's scalable, right? You can kind of redefine what you mean by the people, who the people are in question. But the idea, but once you've defined it, the idea of sovereignty, actually, what's fascinating about this phrase is that it claims that sovereignty is then distributed out among these people. And there's a famous to historians, 1789 little pamphlet called "The Dissertation on the Character of American Citizenship" by a guy named David Ramsey, who was one of the early historians of the American Revolution, a participant in the Revolution. And he writes, the citizen, the lowest citizen, has more dignity than the greatest lord in a kingdom. The least citizen of a republic has more dignity than the greatest lord, because each one of them has within them a piece of the sovereignty, right? In a kingdom, all of the sovereignty in theory resides in the king, right? Whereas in a republic, each person, that is to say, each member of the people has this little kind of spark inside them of sovereignty, which gives them a kind of dignity, which gives them a stake in the polity. So that's why it's important. It's not just that it's a bunch of different people. It's that it's this idea that each person in the republic who is part of this notional people actually has inside them a little bit of the authority, the gravitas, the power that sovereignty carries with it.
I want to move on to the next question, Professor. Again, this is something that you wrote in the book, that you argued it took 2 generations for durable mass political movement to emerge in the age of Atlantic revolutions. The first generation, which dominated revolution before the 1800s, and the second generation rising in the early 19th century succeeded. Now, help us with better understanding. Like, what does that mean? It actually took 2 generations. And again, this is kind of tie into the next question, but I will wait when you finish your explanation for this one. Because when we look at the word generations, we tend to think about the presence of the citizens. And also we're trying to think about the political status or the political change. So that's why it's what we are referring to today is the generational change. It's the transformational, or even I've heard the word is transactional change when we talk about this political ambiguity or this political transformation. But interestingly, that in your book, you argue that it took 2 generations for durable mass political movement to emerge in the age of Atlantic revolutions. Help us with better understanding. What does that mean by dissecting the 2 generations?
Sure. So, there's kind of a specific and a general argument here. The specific argument really is about the particular context of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And what I'm arguing there is that the people in the late 18th century, the people in the American, the French, the Haitian Revolution, they have a new kind of problem because they believe, as we've just discussed, they believe that, there should be new ways of organizing politics, right? There should be new ways of organizing social life. They have, from a variety of different sources, new ideas that they're trying to enact. The problem is, there are a lot of vested interests that they have to overcome in order to do that, right? There are rather powerful monarchies, elite bodies, right? Even, in a lot of places, a peasantry or a sort of urban working class that's, not doing great, but maybe worries about what might happen if the existing order breaks down. And so in order to actually, to create political change, to push political change, they've got to mount large-scale political movements. But this is not something that really exists in the 18th century before this period. The idea of kind of mass political organizing is not a common phenomenon before the 1870s and 80s, 1770s and 80s. It's not that there aren't mass movements from time to time, but they're very short-lived. They kind of come together and then they disperse again. And so what I really argue in the kind of specific case of the Atlantic Revolution is that it really takes almost 30 years for them to figure out how to do this. And it's not the original group that really figures it out. There's a kind of Israelites wandering in the desert quality here, that the first generation kind of sees what they need to do, but just can't get there, and tries over and over again to organize mass movements, which over and over again fall apart. But they basically create the conditions for a new generation that has a more intuitive understanding, I think, of the possibilities of organizing across really lines of class, lines of caste, of racial and ethnic difference. And they're much better able to put together mass movements that kind of hold together. And that's what you see after 1800. You see these political movements that, suddenly are able to hold together over, not only a year or 2 years, but, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years in a way that almost nothing before 1800 does. So that's the specific argument about the late 18th, early 19th century, that there's this transition. But I think more broadly, and, here I'm just kind of speaking, about the way one might think about the 20th century too, or 21st century, we have this habit of thinking about revolution as being like a thing that happens from one day to the next, right? We love talking about these moments when, someone storms, the Congress building, or, the king is overthrown. I think that tends to distract us from the ways in which it takes a really long time to convince people to change the way that they do things, to build new kinds of institutions, to bring new ideas into the public sphere. And so the argument I really try to push in this book is that we need to think about revolution as a longer process. That it's not a switch that gets flipped. And I think that, again, I'm no specialist in the 20th or 21st centuries, but I think there is evidence where, places where you can see that as well in the 20th and 21st centuries, that a lot of the revolutionary movements that we think about actually germinate for quite a while. And even once they take control of the state, for instance, it's a long process to kind of consolidate their power and really sort of settle in to a new normal, if you will. So that's really what I want to try to push for, is a way of looking at revolution that is sort of more drawn out, more extensive, and less about these kind of moments of flipping, which are fascinating and very compelling and exciting to read about. But again, I think sometimes give a false impression of what revolutionary politics really is.
It is, Professor. Let's talk about, of course, again, when we talk about the word revolution, I know you spent good amount of content on one of the key concepts that when we talk about the revolution, which related to the anti-slavery revolution. I mean, again, you mentioned that the first modern anti-slavery revolution began in 1791. I mean, again, Professor, as you mentioned before, a lot of founding fathers in American history, they were slave owners. And as a matter of fact, that what we'll have to say that when we look at the history today, we're trying to pay closer examination. There's no doubt some of the founding fathers eventually realized, hey, listen, we need to stop this behavior. But others believed that that's the way it is. Again, despite that we like it or not. Now, in your book, why is it important for us to understand this slavery movement or anti-slavery revolution? And of course, also that the island, it was just created as a slave society. So help us with better understanding how does slavery played in this book, and also why is it even more critical to understand this anti-slavery revolution? Go ahead.
Yeah. So, I think this has been one of the great acquisitions, one of the great developments of the past, let's say, 50 years in the history of the revolutionary era, is we've really come to grapple with the fact, the place of anti-slavery in this world. And, in some ways it's natural, because if you think about slavery, what slavery is a system it's a labor system, of course, at bottom, right? It's a way of extracting labor. But it's also a social system in which one group of people, enslaved people, are placed at the bottom of the social order. They are considered legally to be objects, right? Under the law, they're objects. Of course, everybody at the time knows that they're people and have human emotions and actions and all of that, right? And they are very careful to think about that, but in the law, they're objects, right? And they're there permanently. They never, their status can never change, and their status is heritable, right? So what this is it's a form of hierarchy, a form of domination, a form of caste, right? Which is designed to be permanent and total in a sense. And so in that sense, it's the most perfect expression of what the Revolutionary Era claims to be trying to destroy, right? Insofar as revolutionaries in every part of the Atlantic world, their argument is, this is a fight for whatever, equality, brotherhood, liberty, freedom, whatever word you use, any of those words, slavery is the opposite of it. And they're very conscious of that. They use the word slavery all the time. This is famously, the American colonists constantly go on and on about their slavery to England, right? To the great amusement of many English commentators, British commentators in the period, who say, what are these American slave masters doing talking about slavery when they are enslavers, right? So slavery is central, really, to thinking about what the revolutions do and don't accomplish. And I think you got to put your finger on it exactly, that in the American Revolution, there's a really ambiguous, tense, difficult relationship among let's say, the founding fathers, or among the leaders, the elite of the American Revolution, because they are cognizant, they understand that slavery, the institution of slavery, is fundamentally in some ways contradictory to the principles that they're articulating, but it's also the foundation of the social system in half of this future country, right? And half of what becomes the United States. And even where it isn't a foundation in the North, let's say, it's extremely important to the overall economic system, either directly or indirectly through trade with the Caribbean, for instance. So, they end up with a very ambiguous, very contradictory way of dealing with it, right? They kind of denounce it and at the same time protect it, right? They denounce parts of it, try to abolish parts of it, defend it in many other ways. So this is why, in the end, the Haitian Revolution, the revolution in Saint-Domingue. So Saint-Domingue is an island. Santo Domingo is an island in the Caribbean, one of the larger islands in the Caribbean. It's the eastern half of it is Spanish. The western half of it is French in the 18th century. And the western half becomes, by 1789, by the outbreak of the French Revolution, it is the most profitable plantation colony in the world. It produces just unbelievable quantities of sugar, coffee, indigo, and a number of other sort of valuable tropical products. Just enormous fortunes are basically being made there off the backs of about 500,000 enslaved people of African descent. The death rates are astonishing. If like 10% of the enslaved population dies every year, it's, astonishing, terrible. So this then becomes the kind of center of this anti-slavery revolution that breaks out in 1791, which is led initially probably by conspiracy, a kind of, a plot among enslaved people and some formerly enslaved people who organize a series of kind of coordinated revolts. And then there's a kind of melee of warfare, self-emancipation, re-enslavement that goes on all through the 1790s. It's very complicated. A lot of it is described in the book. If your listeners are interested, they can find out more about it. But that's, so that becomes kind of the heart in some sense. Insofar as slavery is the most pure expression of what is bad about the old regime, let's say, the abolition of slavery, the attack on slavery, the assault on slavery in Saint-Domingue, that's the title of the chapter about it, the assault on slavery, is the purest expression in some sense of the ideals of the revolutionary era.
Professor, I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about one of the chapters, which is entitled The Worlds Napoleon Made. Now, I mean, again, if I know you're laughing, but when we talk about the history, and of course that we have to bring Napoleon into the picture. I mean, this is not something that a person can just randomly escape from the memories. I mean, of course, I have to say, it's one of the most controversial figures in American history when we talk about Napoleon. Now, Professor, again, I didn't get a chance to finish reading the whole chapter, but I have to pause as I was reading and really start to reflect on the words and the stories that you cover. But I want to get to the question right away. Why is it important to talk about Napoleon? And also, again, we're talking about the world. It's not just singular, it's the plural. So what are you trying to refer when we talk about Napoleon and also this different sections or different interpretations of the world? Go ahead.
Good, thanks. Yeah, look, Napoleon is. I think you're absolutely right. He's in French they say incontournable, which means like you kind of can't get around him. He's unavoidable in this period, and I think it's for the simple reason that he is. To put it in the terms of the book, I think he's one of the greatest organizers of mass politics in the late 18th and early 19th century. Once upon a time, the story that people told about Napoleon was that he's this sort of brutal dictator who sort of, is like a totalitarian before his day, right? A kind of precursor to, Stalinism or something. And it's not tenable. One of the most interesting things about the Napoleonic regime is that Napoleon spends quite a lot of time and effort having these big elections every time he wants to do something, sort of change his status politically. So there are a series of referendums in France I'm going to get the dates wrong, but I think it's 1801, 1804, 1806. There's another one in, I think, 1810. There's one in 1814. I may have the dates a little off. It's all in the chapter. But anyway, there are a series of referendums, and the participation rates are enormous. Something like 3 million people vote in the last one of those, which is an astonishing rate of participation. That's as large as the entire population of the United States in the beginning of this period. So, he's not a Democrat, right? He becomes emperor, of course, right? But he's certainly someone who understands the power of mass politics, of getting the people on your side, and of ruling through a version of, to come back to the initial place we started, right, the sovereignty of the people. Now, he kind of borrows it for himself, right? But he understands that the sovereignty comes from the people, really. The power comes from the people. And he is able to not only accumulate it himself, but then also in the form of his enormous mass army that he creates, like largest armies that Europe had ever seen, really. He actually manages to project the power of the people, so to speak, outside of France. So for me, the idea, Napoleon is really a figure of mass politics. He's a creator of mass politics. He's a creation of mass politics. And part of what he does is everywhere he goes, he kind of, even people who hate him kind of notice this and see, mass politics, this is really powerful. If you can get, 50% of the population behind you on anything, that's a really powerful position. You can do incredible things. Terrible maybe, but very impressive. And so in the Netherlands, in Italy, in Spain, in North America, in Eastern Europe, in all of these places, you see different groups kind of learning the lesson of the Napoleonic state, learning the lesson of Napoleonic mass politics, and kind of developing their own local versions of it. So that's what I meant by world in that chapter title. Is I really think he kind of spreads a way of doing politics, which is then appropriated and rethought and reshaped in each of these different places, but it's discernibly coming from him and has some similarities in form.
Of course,
and it's the world we live in now, right? The world of mass politics.
That's right. Of course, Professor, when we talk about Napoleon, I believe the conversation is going to last more than 3 hours. Well, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question, Professor, going back to the title of the book, The Age of Revolutions and the Generations Who Made It. Now, Professor, help us again with better understanding. What would you expect the readers to understand when they finish reading the last chapter of this book? I mean, again, this is a good, well-documented historical, factual information. Again, a lot of stories and a lot of factual information that you included. It's a good reminder for all the readers to understand how far this country has come, and of course, and how far this country still have to go. But so what are your expectations, and what would you be the best takeaway for the readers? Your final thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to give everything away, but because you got to read the book. But the story that the book really tries to tell, and this is really where the book comes to in the conclusion. The story that it tries to tell is one about the ambiguity and I think the kind of the double-sided, Janus-faced quality of revolutionary politics in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So, I think we're very inclined. Look, we are inheritors, as I've said several times. We're inheritors of the revolutionary era as people who live in versions of modern democracies or republics. Even people who don't live in democratic regimes, it's kind of it's the norm in the world, right? And any deviation from it has to be kind of explained and justified. So we're the inheritors of this, and I think we tend to look back at this period and say, oh, look, here are all the good things that we have now, democracy, participation, right, equality before the law. And it's true, those things do come out of this era, but there's also a lot of stuff that's not so pretty that comes out of this era, right? There's the second wave of European colonialism, right? European colonialism, European territorial empire in East Asia, in South Asia, extractive capitalism in Africa, in South America. A lot of that stuff is the result of some of the political and military and economic reconfiguration of the Age of Revolution. At the same time, as you hinted in your first question, the inclusivity of the Age of Revolutions also makes some of the outer boundaries of politics sharper, right? So in North America, just to give so let's go back to the United States. In the United States, in various states, until the early 19th century, Black men could vote in elections if they owned enough property. So in New York State, for instance, Black men had the vote if they owned enough property. In 1821, the New York State Constitution is revised to make all white men, regardless of property ownership, eligible to vote. But Black men are prohibited regardless of how much property they own, right? So the line shifts from being a kind of class line to being a racial line. And it takes decades to undo that new kind of exclusion, right? Women don't get the right, women have the right to vote in New Jersey until 1806, and they don't get it back until, 1917, almost 100 years later. So I think, in a sense, what the argument of the book is, and what I sort of my plea is, and I hope that this is what readers get from it, is that we need to think about this era in a more nuanced way and kind of reflect on the way in which it's the germ of the origin of both the good, many of the good and many of the not so good things that characterize modern politics, right? The notions of inclusion, equality, and freedom, but also the kinds of exclusions, the limitations, the violence at times of modern politics. And so I hope in some way that it helps us try to understand, as you suggested in your introduction, some of the ways that our world is broken today in various forms.
That's right, Professor. I agree with you 100%. The world is broken today. And of course, that in order to understand and decipher the brokenness and the complication of the political system, not just in America, but around the world. And again, going back to what I said in the intro, it's important to look at history and also to understand some of the historical facts and, of course, the truthful information that can actually help us continue to reflect upon and even help us or even challenge us to think more about our political behavior and also our political attitudes today. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Professor Nathan Perl-Rosenthal. Again, Professor, it's professor at the History of University of Southern California, and I strongly encourage everyone go online and check out his amazing book, which is called The Age of Revolutions and the Generations Who Made It. Well, Professor Rosenthal, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure and love to have you back on the show for future episodes. And thank you so much for doing this.